some noise. So with that, it is your time, James. We're taking a deep breath because we're in for the street with you. Can you say something and we see if the recording works?
Hello. Great to be with you again.
It works. Okay.
Awesome.
All right.
All right. Well, today I'm going to begin with the lesson and then go into the meditation. And even before I do that, I want to put something in the chat stream if that's possible. Here we go. Okay. So I'm going to be using I'm going to be speaking of some names and some terms that you may be less familiar with. I'm not going to assume that you are familiar with these terms, just to help sort of follow along as I go through the talk. So you see that sort of the spelling. So you should be able to see that in the chat stream now. These different names and terms that I'm going to be referencing in regard to Eastern mysticism, Eastern part of the mystic paradigm. So we learn new terms and new names as we go along in this series. And today it's going to be about mysticism as found in Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism. So I begin with the story of 1600 years ago in China. There was a boy named Xuan Sang who became fascinated by Buddhism, even though he was raised in a Confucian household. In China, it was not uncommon for a very long time for people to consider themselves Confucians and Taoists and Buddhists all at the same time. They didn't see any separation. In any case, he became fascinated, Xuan did, with Buddhism. At the age 13, he became a Buddhist novice monk in the Temple of Heavenly Radiance. I love the name of that, the Temple of Heavenly Radiance. Soon after, there was a social and political upheaval in the region. That was a time of great social unrest. And so Xuan moved to another region in China and became a full monk at the age of 20. Then later, he was transferred to the Temple of Great Learning, where monks translated Indian Buddhist texts into Chinese. So this was a significant scholarly work that Xuan found himself in. And as he studied the translations, he found that there were many errors in the text. There were many places that were incomplete. And so he decided to travel to India to acquire original Indian texts to translate himself. As he was leaving China or trying to get to India, he was stopped at the border for traveling without a permit. Yep, even in those days, you needed visas. Mm-hmm. As it happened, though, the officer in charge was a Buddhist and decided to let Xuan go ahead with his travels. But in order to avoid another such incident, Xuan left the main path and traveled an arid desert region. After a time, he became weak from lack of food and water. Fortunately for Xuan, he had a very smart horse. The horse changed directions on its own and took him to a place of water and pasture. Eventually, he got to Samarkand, a major trade center of that era. Later, Xuan would write of the great wealth and the pleasant climate of Samarkand, but he was not tempted to stay there. He was determined to fulfill his mission to find truth. In fact, Xuan wrote a detailed account of travels along the Silk Road from China to India, which is a valuable document today about the times and the geography and the peoples of that era. And as he was traveling, he acquired Indian Buddhist texts. As he continued south, he came upon more monasteries and acquired more texts, including a kind of encyclopedia of Buddhist writings and commentaries. The most important text that Xuan found was called Yogacara. Yogacara is a Buddhist text analyzing perception, consciousness, including a psychology of therapeutic principles and meditation practices. Yogacara puts forward an idealist metaphysics theory. We talked about that in the past. In this case, the theory was that consciousness is all there is, consciousness only. Now, this Buddhist teaching is similar to Western forms of idealism, such as we discussed regarding Plotinus, but others, Berkeley, Kant, Hegel, and so on, the Western metaphysical tradition. Swan studied in India for 16 years and brought back 657 Buddhist writings to be translated from Sanskrit into Chinese. And then Swan wrote his own interpretation of the Yogacara teachings in a work titled Treatise on the Establishment of the Doctrine of Consciousness Only. We won't go into the details of his treatise, but simply jump to his conclusion. He wrote, "Therefore, everything produced from causes, everything not produced from causes, and everything seemingly real or unreal are all inseparable from consciousness." Now, the goal in the consciousness-only school, as it was called, as in other schools of Buddhism, is distinguish between the real and the unreal in consciousness to attain the pure consciousness of nirvana, or bliss. It is a form of mysticism that is similar in its approach to the path in Hinduism that's known as Jnana Yoga, Jnana yoga. It's a form of mysticism that's found both in Indian and Chinese Buddhism, which has the goal of attaining union with the absolute reality of pure consciousness underlying all appearances and all the content of consciousness. Now, Western and Hindu mysticism generally refer to this experience as union with God. The consciousness-only school and other Buddhist mysticisms call the ultimate state nirvana rather than God. When we explore Middle Eastern and Western mysticism in the next couple of weeks, we will see that the description of union with God found in these other traditions has the same characteristics spoken of in Buddhism as nirvana. Hindu mysticism, like Middle Eastern and Western mysticisms, use that term God. In Hindu, it's Brahma, that term for supreme being or ultimate reality. Hindu mysticism also frequently refers to the ultimate, or Brahma, as Atman, which means self. But this self, as it's usually translated, should not be confused with the ego or limited sense of self identified with the body and personality in human consciousness. The self is something beyond that. In Hinduism, there's a saying, Atman is Brahma, self is God. Now, the Upanishads express the earliest Hindu mystical philosophy, but it's nearly impossible to ascertain the earliest time frames in which the Upanishads were written. The estimates of the earliest texts vary from as early as 800 BC to as late as 200 BC. That latter date would place them after the origin of Buddhism. And some of the Upanishads are later Upanishads go up to 1500 AD. So the Upanishads consist of a large number of books written over a long period of time. The Upanishads represent a shift away from the Vedic era of polytheistic poems and rituals toward rationalism and mysticism in Hindu religion. European and Middle Eastern cultures developed a more monistic and rationalistic worldview around the same time as the Upanishads were written. Mysticism only becomes possible when consciousness shifts from mythological thinking and belief in external gods to rational thinking and, through meditation, consciousness of divine omnipresence. So we see such a shift in global consciousness in the period between 800 and 200 BC. In this era, the shift occurred with the emergence of Greek and Jewish philosophy in the European area, in the Middle East, Confucianism and Taoism in China, and Buddhism and the Upanishads in India. So this shift towards a more rational or reasoning approach to reality, and at the same time, a practice of meditation. This happens basically everywhere in the world in this era. This new paradigm of reality includes the ideas that the ultimate is omnipresent, yet not perceptible with the senses. It is indescribable in finite language and without boundaries. And by the way, you'll find this same perspective on God in Charles Fillmore's writing, especially in a chapter called God Presence in the book Jesus Christ Heals. But we're going to stick with Eastern mysticism for now. One way, because this divine ultimate is indescribable in language, it cannot be said to be known in the usual way, yet it can be experienced. So this idea of an experience that is yet indescribable, but nevertheless is knowledge. One way to experience the ultimate reality is turning away from the contents of consciousness, including perceptions or sensations, feelings, and thoughts, toward a pure or empty consciousness, as it's sometimes called, towards that ultimate self, or Buddha mind, as it's called in Buddhism. And another way, and these are the two most common ways, one is through this turning away from the sensory world and inward to find the divine. And another way to expand our consciousness of oneness is by focusing on love. These are two primary ways they're taught in mysticism. In this divine union, one then discovers the true self by dissolving the false and limited self into infinite consciousness, merging with the infinite. Now, here are some sayings from Eastern mysticism that indicate the omnipresence of the divine. We read in the Upanishads, those who know the high Brahman, the vast, hidden in the bodies of all creatures, and alone enveloping everything, as the Lord, they become immortal. So this idea of an omnipresent divine nature that can be known in the sense of being experienced. Knowing this, they say, they become immortal, because it is, of course, again, the immortal self that one is actually experiencing. We read in the Duality Teachings from Taoism, all pervading is the great Tao. Of course, the Tao means the way, but it really refers to this ultimate reality that one can align with or become, enter into a consciousness of. All pervading is the great Tao. It can be at once on the right hand and on the left. All things depend on it for life, and it rejects them not. It loves and nourishes all things. All things return to it. All things under heaven are products of being, but being itself is the product of non-being. So being, in this context, signifies the immanence of the divine presence in nature, and non-being signifies that ultimate and transcendent reality, the divine potential. Potential is sort of by definition non-existent. In other words, it's not an actual physical form or thing that can be described. It transcends space and time. So we have this idea in mysticism, not only in Taoism, but as we'll see in Western mysticism, of God as not being, or no thing, as sometimes called in the Western forms, Christian forms of mysticism especially. Now, because our perceptions are finite, in mysticism, the world of human perceptions is sometimes regarded as an illusion, or talked about as an illusion. One of my favorite expressions of that idea is found in the writings of the Taoist philosopher Chuang Tzu. Chuang Tzu wrote, "Once I, Chuang Tzu, dreamed that I was a butterfly and was happy as a butterfly. I was conscious that I was quite pleased with myself. but I did not know that I was Chuang. Ultimately, I awoke, and then I was visibly Chuang. I do not know whether it was Chuang dreaming that he was a butterfly or the butterfly dreaming that it was Chuang. Very often, when Chuang Tzu is depicted in Taoist art, there is also in the picture with him the butterfly. Chuang Tzu went on to write, when we dream, we do not know that we are dreaming. In our dreams, we may even interpret our dreams. Only after we awake do we know we have dreamed. Finally, there comes a great awakening, and then we know life is a great dream. So this is one example of a way of talking about the world of perceptions as, one might say, somewhat illusionary, like a dream. Another writer, much later in the Hindu tradition, was Adi Shankara. He lived around the 8th century, is one of those characters it's difficult to date with any exactness historically, but around the 8th century AD, Adi Shankara. He is regarded as the most influential, possibly the most significant of all Hindu philosophers and mystics. Shankara wrote commentaries on the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita, the famous story of Vishnu and Krishna and anyway, Bhagavad Gita, famous Hindu popular text. So he wrote commentaries on that, and he also developed more fully the Hindu school of what's called non-dualism. Non-dualism basically means the same thing in English as unity, right? Well, in this teaching, it is asserted that God alone is real and nature is a kind of illusionary appearance. And so Shankara writes, expresses in a way similar to Chuang Tzu in the Taoist tradition. Shankara wrote, like an image in a dream, the world is troubled by lust, hatred, and other poisons. So long as the dream lasts, the image appears to be real, but on awakening, it vanishes. So again, we have this same language in another place in another time in the East of the dream from which we must awaken in order to achieve this true, what we're calling mystical union. Now, one of the most popular Buddhist texts is the Heart Sutra, which was composed around the 7th century AD or possibly earlier. The Heart Sutra probably originated in India, but there's some controversy about that among scholars. So some say it originated in India. Some of these things are very difficult to trace in a way that's entirely satisfactory to the historically oriented Western mind. In any case, this Heart Sutra is possibly the most popular Buddhist text to memorize and recite in Buddhist teachings. Now, it has some rather strange sounding passages, but these strange sounding passages get at or attempt to get at what the philosophy of the Heart Sutra, this Buddhist philosophy, is. For example, we read in the Heart Sutra, form is emptiness, and the very emptiness is form. Emptiness does not differ from form. Form does not differ from emptiness. Whatever is form, that is emptiness. Whatever is emptiness, that is form. The same is true of feelings, perceptions, impulses, and consciousness. What does this apparently paradoxical, counterintuitive saying actually mean? We should recognize that sometimes paradoxical sayings in spiritual and mystical traditions are intended not to convey a meaning that we can understand rationally, but to snap us out of the old, false, or limited ways of rational thinking and perceiving, to snap us out of that and into a direct experience of truth. Those of you who are familiar with Zen Buddhism know about Zen koans. And these are these paradoxical sayings, like what is the sound of one hand clapping, that attempt to help the student snap out of sort of rational, linear, structural way of looking at the world and into a consciousness of experiencing in the present moment, experiencing reality or satori in the present moment. So the Zen Buddhism relies on these kinds of paradoxical type sayings. We even find them to some extent in the teachings of Jesus, where he says, for example, be wise as a serpent and harmless as a dove, right? How exactly can you become both a dove and a serpent? Uh, these are paradoxical types of sayings. But in any case, this type of saying, this emptiness and form being the same thing in the Heart Sutra, may be intended or have been written to intend to convey or to snap the student out of the ordinary ways of seeing the world. It may also really simply suggest the teaching that consciousness itself is not a material substance, so that what we perceive, whether space or form, or the space around a form, or the space within a form, whatever we perceive is empty in the sense that it's not the ultimately real, because consciousness, again in this teaching, is ultimately real. Now, in addition to that, the saying may also be meant to describe the mystical experience itself, experience of emptiness or experience of the Buddha consciousness or the Buddha mind. For we read later in the Heart Sutra these words: it is because of his indifference to any kind of personal attainment that a bodhisattva, through having relied on the perfection of wisdom, dwells without thought coverings. In the absence of thought coverings, he has not been made to tremble. He has overcome what can upset, and in the end, he attains nirvana. Full emptiness is the basis also of Buddhahood. This emphasis on emptying ourselves is a common theme in all forms of mysticism in one way or another. But the primary idea in mysticism of the mystical experience is that the divine is not perceptible in the way that what we call the world is perceptible. It is not describable in the way that we might describe something that we experienced. Nevertheless, this ultimate reality is the source of all that and is the true self. In Hinduism, the idea, the word Atman signifies this true self. So we read in the Upanishads, the self is the Lord of all, inhabitant of the hearts of all. So there's that idea of the divine within. He is the source of all, creator and dissolver of beings. There is nothing he does not know. He is not knowable by perception, turned inward or outward, nor by both combined. He is neither that which is known, nor is he the sum of all that might be known. Cannot be seen, grasped, bargained with. He is undefinable, unthinkable, indescribable. The only proof of his existence is union with him. The world disappears in him. He is peaceful, the good, the one without a second. If we set aside the common reference to God as, or the ultimate reality as of masculine gender, and what you see in Taoism, more often the Tao is associated with mother or the feminine. If we set those sort of limited ideas aside and get at what's being said here, it is that we can only prove the existence of this higher reality by means of union with it. And the union with it, we find, in the union with it, we find perfect peace, the good, the one and only reality. You might recall from last week's discussion that the idea of the good is right next to, in Plotinus's philosophy, right next to, or the first sort of emanation from the indescribable one. And so good, absolute good, is associated with this divine reality. Now, another place we find this idea that the ultimate cannot be explained or expressed in words, we find at the very beginning of the Tao Te Ching, the classic textbook of Taoism. It says the Tao which can be expressed in words is not the eternal Tao. The name which can be uttered is not the eternal name. Without a name, it is the beginning of heaven and earth. With a name, it is the mother of all things. So, in the Tao Te Ching, when they're talking about the Tao, they're using that word so they can talk about it, but they recognize, or the author Lao Tzu recognizes that even the name Tao is not the true or eternal name. It cannot be named. It cannot be described, but it can be experienced because it is the perceiver and not the perceived. It is imperceptible. This Tao, or this self, or this Atman, or this divine nature. It is the perceiver, but it is not that which is perceived. And in this sense, it cannot be known. As it says again in the Hindu Upanishads, who says that spirit is not known, knows. Who claims that he knows nothing. The ignorant think that spirit lies within knowledge. The wise man knows it is beyond knowledge. Spirit is known through revelation. The living man who finds spirit finds truth. So the truth, which cannot be expressed or described in ordinary language, must come to us by what the Upanishads in this passage calls a revelation. In Taoism, we also find this expression that this divine nature cannot be known in a conventional way, and it has language similar to what we find in the Upanishads. The Tao Te Ching, it says, to know that you do not know is best. To pretend to know when you do not know is a disease. Certainly Socrates would have agreed with this Taoist perspective, that it's important to know that you do not know in order to arrive at this experience which cannot be described and therefore cannot be said to be known in any conventional way. As I mentioned last week, in the general description of the mystic paradigm, the method of mystics involves turning desire and attention away from the world of sense perception and toward the nature of this divinity that is everywhere and within us. This innate divinity is called by different names in the different traditions. The Atman of Hinduism, the Buddha, Nirvana, Christ, in the Western tradition, God, or in Taoism, the Tao, the way. But by whatever name, the divine within is experienced as pure consciousness, love, oneness, joy, bliss, and enlightenment. Those words fall short of the actual experience, obviously, because to say we can describe it in these terms is also not true. But they bring us closer to what a closer understanding to what this divine reality of our being is. And again, as mentioned last week, non-attachment or renunciation of desires is mentioned in some form in most mystic writings. This is true again in the Eastern texts. The Upanishads say, when all desires that dwell in the heart cease, then the mortal becomes immortal and obtains Brahman. This idea of desires that dwell in the heart is, of course, aimed at the desires related to the perceptible world, in contrast to the aspiration, which is another kind of desire, to know the divine, the turning inward to find the divine as an ultimate goal or aspiration. Again, we look at the Tao Te Ching, Taoism, Chinese mysticism, if you will. And this is what it says about the Tao. Only one who is ever free of desire can apprehend its spiritual essence. He who is ever slave to desire can see no more than its outer fringe. So again, this aspect of the mystic paradigm is turning away from our usual desires of the world in order that we may seek with greater aspiration and desire the ultimate nature of our reality, the Tao, Brahma, Nirvana, God. Again, concentration is essential in all the mystic paths, or what we usually call meditation. And concentration to achieve consciousness of the ultimate can actually be done in many different ways. It can be done with words, it can be done with images, it can be done with sounds. You're concentrating on something to penetrate to the essence of it, because the essence of whatever you concentrate on is the divine. Now, Shankara, who I referred to earlier, this great Hindu philosopher, said this conception, I am Brahman itself, incessantly entertained, disperses the hallucinations born of ignorance, as medicine disperses illness. So Shankara suggested as a point of concentration, incessantly entertained, as he puts it, this simple statement, I am Brahma itself. I am Brahma itself. In a Western tradition, one might blasphemously say, I am the Christ, or I am God itself. And it would mean the same thing that Shankara is suggesting here. And this is one of the reasons, especially in the West, the Western world, mystics have approached something that seems, in their words and their practices, something that seems blasphemous to those of a more traditional and conventional interpretation, mythological interpretation to some extent, of reality, of religion. So Shankara, this idea, I am Brahman itself, I am the Christ itself, as we might say in the Christian tradition, this will disperse hallucinations born of ignorance, and its medicine disperses illness. He goes on to say, Shankara does, that the yogin, possessing perfect discernment, contemplates all things as subsisting in himself, and thus, by the eye of knowledge, discovers that all is the one spirit. He knows that all this movable world is spirit, or that beyond spirit there is nothing. As all varieties of vase are clay, so all things he sees are spirit. This idea common in mysticism, again, of the mystic perceiving the divine in waking life behind or in or as everything. Now, the most the Hindu philosopher who most focused on methodology and basically whose writings became the source of all yogic practices was someone named Patanjali. And again, Patanjali is one of those characters who's very difficult to isolate in terms of time. When exactly did he live? So the estimates have varied from between the 3rd century BC to the 4th century AD. Can't quite figure out exactly when he lived, but sometime a long, long time ago, as they say. His writing is usually called the Yoga Sutras. And again, it's the basis of all yogic practices. Now, Patanjali used the word samyama, which again is in your chat stream, samyama, to refer to this practice of sustained meditation, sustained concentration on an ideal until one is absorbed into the idea or one with the idea, becomes inseparable from the idea. Because again, the essence of all ideas that we might concentrate on is this divine nature. So I use the word samyama to talk about that process. The method is, to a certain extent, is simplicity itself. It begins with practicing physical stillness, and one goes on to observe one's breathing, which later became the various methods of breath control that are found in what's called pranayama in Hinduism. But the observing of the breathing, and then the drawing of the attention inward And as one draws the attention inward to a point or an idea for concentration, one begins to meditate, concentrate until one attains this complete absorption. Samyama, according to Patanjali, samyama on different things results in various powers. And it's interesting to look at the different powers that he lists and what one needs to concentrate on. But I'll mention a few of the powers he says one can attain in various forms of concentration. One can attain complete control of one's physical organs. One can attain memory of past lives. One can attain knowledge of another person's mind, or the power of invisibility, or various qualities such as friendship, mercy, strength, and so on. So concentration on different things leads to different powers, is part of Patanjali's teaching. But toward the end of the sutras, Patanjali wrote, by making samyama, this concentration, on the discrimination between sattva, which means goodness, and the purusha, which means the observer self, by making samyama on that discrimination between goodness and the self, come omnipotence and omniscience. My goodness, omnipotence and omniscience. But it doesn't, the sutras do not stop there. At this point, in the text, the yogi is supposed to have arrived at a full discrimination between nature and self. But the next verse says, by giving up even these powers comes the destruction of the very seed of evil, which leads to kaivalya. Kaivalya is a technical Hindu term, but it means, in effect, liberation from the wheel of karmic rebirth and union with the divine self or Brahma. The union, the liberation, is attained once the yogi has achieved omnipotence and omniscience and then lets that go. Now, as I mentioned, contemplation of love is regarded as that other way to the divine union in most mystic traditions. Now, there's one Buddhist meditation I've come across that I especially like, and that's what I'm going to share with you for a meditation today. This Buddhist meditation is a meditation on love. One of its names is the Four Sublime States, meditation on the Four Sublime States. According to the Buddhist tradition, this meditation was taught by the Buddha himself, by Gautama Buddha. And so that's where I want to close today, asking you to join me in this meditation. And so I would ask you now to find a position of stillness that is comfortable yet attentive, what's in Hinduism called asana position or posture. Take a few moments to focus your attention on your breathing as a way of drawing your attention inward, feeling the breath. Now we begin the meditation on the four sublime states. Here, with thoughts of benevolence, one pervades first one direction, then a second direction, then a third direction, then a fourth direction, then above, then below, then all around. Thoughts of benevolence, goodwill, directing these thoughts of goodwill or feeling of goodwill, benevolence, in all directions, focusing that benevolence in the directions around you, in front of you, behind you, to the right, and to the left. Holding these thoughts, holding this feeling of goodwill above and below you, and all around you. Meditation goes on to say, identifying oneself with all, one pervades the entire universe with thoughts of benevolence, with the heart grown great, wide, deep, boundless, purified of all ill will. the first sublime state, benevolence all around you, goodwill, love all around you. Next, here with thoughts of compassion. One pervades first one direction, then a second direction, then a third direction, then a fourth direction, then above, then below, then all around. Our thoughts are of a sphere all around us, expanding in all directions. Thoughts of compassion, feeling a sense of empathy with others and the desire to be supportive of others, kind of combination of sympathy and benevolence, compassion. As you direct your thoughts, you might think of individuals you know or that you've heard of or seen, and direct towards them these thoughts, this feeling of compassion. Not only towards people, but for all living creatures and the universe itself. Identifying oneself with all. One pervades the entire universe with thoughts of compassion, with heart grown great, wide, deep, boundless, purified of all ill will, experiencing ourselves as a center of a limitless sphere of compassion. Here, with thoughts of joyous sympathy, one pervades first one direction, and a second direction, and a third direction, and a fourth direction, and above and below and all around. Joyous sympathy. What does this mean? Rejoicing with the joys and celebrations of others, the joys, feeling the joys of life all around you, above you, below you, all around you in the sphere of joy. Identifying oneself with all. One pervades the entire universe. Thoughts of joyous sympathy, with heart grown, great, wide, deep, boundless, purified of all ill will, benevolence, passion, joyous sympathy, all around, without limits, extending through the whole universe. Here, with thoughts of equanimity, one pervades first one direction, then a second direction, then a third direction, then a fourth direction, then above, then below, then all around. Equanimity, calm, composure, acceptance of all as equal, acceptance of all without fear, all conditions, calm, composure, equanimity. All directions. all directions, benevolence, compassion, joyous sympathy, equanimity, identifying oneself with all. One pervades the entire universe with thoughts of equanimity, heart grown great, wide, deep, boundless, purified of all ill will. So for a few moments, we rest in this consciousness of limitless love and peace. In this consciousness, limitless love and peace, we bless all living creatures. We bless the universe itself. We merge with the true self that is this pure joy and love and peace. And so, in blessing all living creatures, in blessing the cosmos in this consciousness, we also bless this human form. And we are able to move through the world as an instrument of love, joy, and peace. And so it is. Amen.